Welcome to this presentation of the George Ramsay Memorial Lecture, an event in our year-long celebration of the 225th anniversary of the laying of the cornerstone here at the Sharon Moravian Church. The lecture was held on May 16th, 2024, and was named in honor of the late Brother George Ramsay. He was a long-standing member of the Sharon Moravian Church. He served in many capacities. At one point, he was treasurer of the congregation, and he served numerous stints on the joint board. Brother Ramsay served the wider Moravian Church as a delegate to Island Conference. He served as a member of the executive board of the Moravian Church Barbados Conference, and he was also delegate to Synod. Further afield, he served as a member of the Provincial Board of Administration, the PEC, and he was also provincial delegate to Unity Synod, that is the Synod of the Moravian Church worldwide. Brother Ramsay was a family man, and he spoke lovingly of his wife, Zaineda, and his two sons, Arthur and Alan. He couldn't stop talking about his grandchildren. His memory will live on here at Sharon. The recording of the lecture had some challenges with the audio at the beginning and at the end, but thankfully we were able to capture the body of the lecture. The master of ceremonies was Mrs. Margaret Allman Goddard, a public relations professional, who is also the niece of Brother Ramsay. The speaker was Professor Pedro L.V. Welch. Professor Welch is a retired deputy principal of the University of the West Indies and former dean, Faculty of Humanities and Education, and professor of social and medical history in the Department of History and Philosophy at the University of the West Indies. He is a recipient of a number of awards, and these include a Commonwealth Scholarship in 1984 and a 1992 John Hopkins Fellowship. Professor Welch has written or co-authored several books and articles, including Red and Black Over White, Free Colored Women in Pre-Emancipation Barbados, written in 2000, and Slave Society in the City, Bridgetown, Barbados, 1680 to 1834. He has delivered several public addresses internationally, in the United States of America, in the United Kingdom, France, Canada, several Caribbean countries, as well as in Barbados. He has also served as an historical consultant to the BBC and the NBC, including in the film portraying the ancestry of the acclaimed actress Gwyneth Paltrow. He served for several years as chair of the Barbados Task Force on Reparations and is consultant editor of the Journal of Caribbean History. He is the current editor of the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. Since his retirement from the University of West Indies in 2015, he has been installed as Professor Emeritus. He is an ordained elder and an organist of the Breath of Life Seventh-day Adventist Church. He and his wife Joan are the proud parents of Dr. Pedro Andre Welch, a medical specialist serving in the United Kingdom, and Mrs. Jem Bonnet, a teacher at the Maria Holder Nursery School, Sharon. Professor Welch's topic was the role of the Moravian Church on the Barbadian Landscape, with a special emphasis on Sharon. Here is Professor Welch.
I'm going to just give an introductory section here, which again repeats some of what I said to you, the song of my grandfather and others, but also which will help to cement me as being just another brother within the church tonight. It is my special privilege and pleasure to have been invited, as I said, to speak on the question of Moravian Church. The pleasure is multiplied on the basis that though I currently hold membership in another denomination, it was in the Moravian Church, more specifically the Clifton Hill Moravian Church, that I received my first contact with the gospel. My late grandfather, the Reverend Frank H. Barker, was the principal of the South World School, which was the school attached to Clifton Hill. Some people refer to it as the Clifton Hill School, but we also knew it as the South World Boys School and the Girls School. And at that time, he was also the lay minister at the church. This is before his subsequent ordination to the gospel ministry. With him in the pulpit at Clifton Hill, I could hardly escape learning something about Christian doctrine. Indeed, I must say to you that there were times when in the pulpit, in the midst of a sermon, if any of the children were not behaving appropriately, he might stop in the sermon and say, "You, sir," and he would pronounce upon that behavior. It was in the Barker household that my late grandmother, Athalie Aurora Barker, near Padmore, taught me my first prayers. Each night, even though there was no indoor plumbing, and if some of us might be embarrassed, but there's no need to be embarrassed, that was what we all had. There was no indoor plumbing in the house in Clifton Hill. But each night I was instructed to kneel beside the bed and dust my feet off. There was no water inside, so you couldn't wash off your feet, but you would dust your feet off, and then you had to proceed to recite the prayer which all of you know. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. And if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. I might today require a deeper theological understanding of such a prayer, but there's no doubt in my mind that this ritual marked the beginning of a Christian experience that will later develop into something more profound. Additionally, I hold a deep gratitude to a stately lady from St. Joseph, who we all call Tanti Heath. She was a resident of Sugar Hill, St. Joseph, and was sure to have some brightly colored print as a reward for recitations at the Sunday school at Clifton Hill. It is a memory of those days of an innocent childhood that has followed me through all the years and which invokes in me a sense of gratitude at being asked to speak to you on aspects of the history of your church. It was at the Clifton Hill Church where I was first confirmed, had my first communion, delivered my very first sermon, and grew to look forward to the love feast with its ginger beer and a bun. Incidentally, the ladies of Clifton Hill should be asked to patent the recipe for the ginger beer, since to me, at least, it had the capacity to produce a long, deep, but still sweet burning. I don't know if do you still have the love feast? But that was something we all looked forward to at that time. I know that I need to get into the matters of history that you have come here to hear tonight, but I felt I had to share that personal vignette with you. Indeed, though I had acquired membership in another Christian community, the late Reverend Frank Barker and I held such mutual brotherly respect that he asked me on his dying bed to give the eulogy at his funeral. Later, I was to give the eulogy at my grandmother's funeral, both at the Sharon Church. So with that brief personal background, now to the historical matters. And we're looking at the question of Christianity and the enslavement before the Moravian arrival. Before the arrival of the Moravians, between the 1740s and the 1760s, because my understanding is that there was an initial arrival around 1745, but later a more succinct arrival took place in 1765. And so before the arrival of the Moravians, the European settlers of Barbados had introduced a brand of Christianity which pictured all peoples of African descent as being aliens who are not fit to be part of civilized society. We pick up the evidence for that philosophy in the 1661 Slave Code. And if you can see it on the screen, I'm just giving a little snapshot of what the 1661 Slave Code said. It begins, I just go through some of the legalese language that you have here. Whereas heretofore many good laws and ordinances have been made for the governing and regulating and ordering the Negro slaves in this island. Incidentally, it makes reference to the fact there were many other good laws and ordinances. As historians, we have not yet found a law previous to the 1661 slave law, but it is my belief that based on the statement found in the 1661 preamble, that there were other slave laws before 1661. It goes on to say, and these former laws being, and when you see LAWES, that is the original spelling, being in many clauses imperfect and not fully comprehending the true constitution of this government in relation to their slaves, their Negroes, and then it goes on to describe these enslaved people as an heathenish, brutish, and an uncertain, dangerous kind of people. Now, there are some people in our local communities who might be so described. But I would hope that we never describe them on the basis of their race or their racial origin. But this is what was said in the 1661 Slave Code. And it goes on to say of them, this uncertain, dangerous kind of people, to whom if surely in anything we somewhat fathom as being created men, though without the knowledge of God in the world, we have therefore upon mature and serious consideration thought it good to renew and revive whatsoever we have found necessary and useful in the former laws of this isle concerning the ordering and governing of Negroes. In short, what I'm saying here is that we get, before the Moravians arrive and plant themselves at Bunker's Hill and then at Sharon, the fact is that Christianity had arrived, Christianity of a kind had arrived in the Caribbean, in Barbados. But that Christianity in Barbados viewed our African ancestors as being of another type. I want to be charitable to those who wrote the law. In other words, you were human but not quite. You didn't really belong. It is important in reviewing this extract from the first slave law passed in the British colonies to note that the enslaved Africans were viewed as being heathenish and brutish. The word brutish is really a reference to being animal-like. And that's why I said you're human but not quite. On October the 3rd, 1688, the English settlers passed an amended slave code that repeated much of the assertions of the earlier law, declaring that Africans were of, quote, a barbarous, wild, and savage nature, and such as renders them wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of our nation. At Clause 5 of the 1688 law, severe penalties were prescribed for any African, enslaved or not, who had the temerity to strike, quote, any Christian. Thus, another distinction that came to differentiate between Africans and whites was the question of their religious orientation. Interestingly enough, when Africans adopted Christianity, as some did, their earlier identification as being brutish or barbarous or savage continued to be applied as a justification for denying them access to fair and equitable systems of justice. Remember, this is part of the background that Moravians will find when they come to Barbados. From the very beginning of the enslavement in Barbados, the reluctance of enslavers to introduce their enslaved laborers to Christianity was well documented. Richard Ligon, an Englishman who migrated to Barbados in the 1650s and wrote a history of the island, in fact, the first history of the island that I'm aware of, commented on the issue of conversion of the enslaved laborers. From his point of view, some of the enslaved that he had encountered certainly had a desire to be converted. One enslaved laborer was so intrigued by the working of the compass, next slide please, when he saw the working of a compass and saw the needle moving as it were, I think there should be another slide just immediately after that. Yes, that it says that this looking at the compass, put him in the greatest admiration that ever I saw a man. This is Richard Ligon's words. This is what he's speaking about this enslaved man. And so quite gave over his questions and desired me that he might be made a Christian. For he thought to be a Christian was to be endued with all those knowledges he wanted. Let me stop for a moment. This is not in my lecture, but I need to be clear that there are some myths that go around which suggests that the white people wanted to, or would brainwash our ancestors into Christianity. The fact of the matter is that most planters in Barbados had no desire to Christianize their enslaved workers. There's also a myth that the Bible was written by white men to brainwash black people. Written by a white man, and some people, because they hear of the Bible, one verse of the Bible referred to as the King James Version, some people assume that King James wrote a Bible. I'm not aware that King James ever wrote any Bible. But he was the king when the Bible was translated. And translation in itself it has nothing to do with brainwashing. For example, I do speak some Spanish. I taught it for a while. The Spanish let me go for the English first. If you want to say that it's raining cats and dogs, you understand what I mean, do you? You expect to see cats and dogs coming down? We say it's raining cats and dogs. But when the Spanish have no such equivalent, the Spanish say está lloviendo a cántaros. It is raining by the buckets full. But it means exactly what you mean when you say that it is raining cats and dogs. It's just simply a translation, no attempt. And this is what happened with the King James Bible. They translated from the original text, Greek and Hebrew, etc., into English. And at the time that it was translated, the English had not yet expanded fully into slave ownership in the New World. So the Bible that was done by, that was authorized by King James had nothing at all to do with the Christianizing or the brainwashing of our African forefathers. Indeed, I often say to many persons who argue that point, that if you read the same scriptures that people speak about like that, you'll notice that there is a man who people refer to as the Ethiopian eunuch in the scriptures. And the thing about this Ethiopian eunuch, which is fascinating, is that this man is in a chariot. He's riding in a Lamborghini. You know, that's all you're saying. And as he rides in this Lamborghini, he has an encounter with the apostle Philip. And Philip sees him, and the Bible describes him as a man who is from the court of Candace, queen of Ethiopia. This Ethiopian eunuch clearly was literate. That's one of the first things you know about him. He was a reader. And he was reading from the book of Isaiah. And as he read from the book of Isaiah, he wanted to know from Philip, what do these things mean? Is this text talking about somebody else, or is it talking about this man here? The other thing about this man, I said already, he is literate, he is intellectual, he is the treasurer, the chancellor of the exchequer of Queen Candace's court. And he has the Bible before the Bible reaches England and Germany and France. He quotes from the Old Testament because at the time of Jesus' death, the only Bible that was present was the Old Testament. And that's what he was quoting from. I just share that with you because there's some of these myths that go wrong. So here we have this man that Richard Ligon is looking at, speaking about, who wants to be a Christian, but the reason why he wants to be a Christian has nothing to do with brainwashing. The man he has common sense. He looks and he sees a compass. And he's not familiar with it from his culture in Africa. So what he does is, in his own mind, he works out, well, if the people who have made this have been so clever, then I want some of that. And there's nothing at all wrong with wanting some of what the other people have. And that's what he wanted. Next slide, please. This is what Ligon tells us. I promise to do my best endeavor And when I came home, spoke to the master of the plantation and told him that poor Sambo desired much to be a Christian. But his answer, as the answer of the plantation owner, was that the people of that island were governed by the laws of England. And by those laws, we could not make a Christian a slave. I told him my request was far different from that, for I desired to make a slave a Christian. His answer was that it was true. There was a great difference in that. But being once a Christian, he could no more account him a slave, and so lose a hold they had of them as slaves by making them Christians, and by that means should open such a gap as all the planters in the island were cursing. So I was struck mute. This is Ligon talking now. And poor Sambo kept out of the church, as ingenious, as honest, and as good-natured poor soul as ever wore black or ate green. This is Ligon's pronouncement on this enslaved man. Next slide, please. He goes on to say, though some of them were denied Christianity when they earnestly sought it, yet let others have what opinion they please. Yet I am, Ligon again, am of this belief that there are to be found amongst them some who are as morally honest, as conscionable, as humble, as loving to their friends, and as loyal to their masters as any that live under the sun. This is this Barbados just prior to the arrival of the Moravians. In the 1720s, when laws are passed indicating who could vote or who could be elected to the House of Assembly, it was specified that the franchise could only be exercised by males. By who? Males who were white, over 21 years of age, and members of the Church of England. In this context, again, we might note that far from using the Bible as an instrument of brainwashing, the planters did all that they could to prevent the enslaved from becoming Christians. Thus, when Christian groups like the Quakers showed any consideration for the enslaved, such as admitting them to their church services, the planters persecuted and prosecuted them in the courts. Thus, by the 1740s, when you have the first recorded arrival, not of the missionaries yet, but of Moravians in the island, there's a general hostility of planters to the nonconformist churches. Indeed, that hostility would boil over when the Wesleyans, or Methodists, as they're called, arrive and will be manifested by physical attacks on this latter group. Incidentally, as I am continuing to speak, I'm just aware of an omission. When I thank you for your invitation, I also want to acknowledge the Ramsay family. I really want to say I remember George quite well. Because I'm not a young yam anymore, and so I knew many of his family members. Yes, I know that as Moravians, you are quite aware of the origins of your denomination. You are aware of the persecution that drove the founders to find refuge in the lands of Nicholas Ludwig, Count of Zinzendorf. In 1722, he permitted refugees from Bohemia and Moravia to settle on his estate in Berthelsdorf, what is today known now as Saxony in Germany. The first of these refugees established the first Moravian town, which they named Herrnhut. They numbered, according to some estimates, by the mid-18th century, some 200,000 followers. Once they had consolidated their presence, the contact of this group with the New World, and hence with the enslavement of Africans, came in 1731, when as some Moravians were attending a conference in Denmark, some of them came into contact with an enslaved man, Anton, who pleaded with them to send missionaries to the Danish West Indies. Count Zinzendorf was one who heard Anton's narrative, and on his return to Herrnhut, preached an impassioned message which inspired two missionaries, Leonard Dober and another member by the name of David Nishman, and they subsequently traveled to St. Thomas in the Danish West Indies and launched a missionary venture among the enslaved. This pioneering venture led to other missionaries making the journey later to the British West Indies, So in 16, and the other West Indies as well. So in 1735, 3 Moravians left here en route for Suriname. And you might wish to know that the Moravian Church constitutes about 10% of the Christian community in Suriname, and is dated back to this time. Then in the 1770s, missions were established. I'm not talking about Raven now, established missions in Antigua and in Barbados. Much of the information on the Moravian arrival in Barbados is recorded in Oliver Maynard's masterful study on the history of the Moravian Church in the Anglophone Caribbean, and in an historical summary penned by Reverend James Young Edgell. Another excellent source, recent source, is the work penned by Bishop Kingsley Lewis and entitled The Moravian Mission in Barbados, 1816 to 1886. And of course, we have the recent book by Reverend Winnell Curtin Roberts on the Moravians in Antigua and Barbados. So 2 missionaries, John Wood and Andrew Richmond Berger, arrived in 1865. Their initial entry was hard. Within a month of his arrival, Richmond Berger died of yellow fever. Faced with this discouraging episode, Wood left active participation in the Moravian mission. Following this, another missionary, a brother T. Fossard of Full Neck, and that's where you get the name Full Neck here in Barbados, arrived to replace the fallen warrior, but he too died within a week of his arrival. And in case you were wondering, I am currently editing a 1,000-page series of reports that I discovered in the archives in Great Britain in London, which relates to the treatment of yellow fever in Barbados and throughout the Caribbean. Just submitted to the publishers. I'm just ready to hear from them. But the one thing we must understand that at this time, many Europeans died of yellow fever. Whereas while some Africans died, Africans tended to have a greater immunity. So it was not uncommon for boats, a ship to arrive, and half the soldiers, half the sailors dead and gone in a hurry for yellow fever. Thank God we don't have it around now. We may have COVID, but we don't have yellow fever. And the thing about yellow fever, as I discovered in my own research, is the treatment of yellow fever was horrific. One of the ways of dealing with yellow fever is to cause the person suffering with it to vomit. So you administered some a medicine, but I call it a medicine, but it's not really a medicine, a substance called calomel. Calomel is a compound of mercury. And in case you don't know, mercury is a deadly poison. So the doctors of the time were treating patients, but rather than treating them to get them better, they were killing them. So when I read about Brother Richmond Berger and Fossard and these dying, I mean, I can just but imagine what they had to encounter in this environment. Of course, it wasn't until the late 19th century when it was discovered that the vector for yellow fever, contracting yellow fever, is the Aedes aegypti mosquito. But they didn't know that. I mean, I thought it strange that the mosquito, they will record the weather data. So much rain on this time. I've seen, you should see, if you could see things that I've seen in 1790s, 1840s, 1830s, they're writing and they're describing the weather. And they're saying the weather, that the rain has been pouring. And there's been flooding going on. And I assume that if you got rain pouring and flooding going on, that sooner or rather later, one thing in Barbados that you know is that you get some music in your room. And then, you know what I'm talking about. The mosquito comes. And they never worked it out. It took a while until a Cuban doctor, I think he was mulatto, Dr. Finley, he discovered, and then later on, the Americans caught on to it, and that's how we know now. That's how it is. So that's what happened to many missionaries. Now, soon after 1767, Brother Benjamin Brookshaw arrived. He was from Bedford in England, and he began walking through the island, particularly in the parish of St. Thomas, seeking contact with the various estates. Though there was some hostility, Brookshaw made friends with a few members of the Anglican clergy. So let me make it abundantly clear that while some members of the Anglican clergy were slave owners, while some of them did not see our ancestors as being true human beings, not all of them were like that. And I suspect that in every congregation, you will find people that some people might label as well-meaning dragons. You find some of them in every congregation. So I don't think you have them in Moravian Church, but let's leave that. Have that. In particular, one planter of Mr. Jackman, you know the area of Jackman's near Hostel Turning. I believe that area belonged to him. He invited the missionaries to preach to the enslaved on his plantation. And other estates that appeared friendly to the missionaries included Lairs, Exchange, Friendly Hall, Vaucluse, and Grandview. Later, other estates would permit the gospel to be preached to the enslaved, and these would include Mount Wilton, Yorkshire Hall, Dunscombe, that was an estate, and Farmers. Dunscombe became the name of the church but it was the name of an estate. Even later, Edmund Haynes of Haynesfield Plantation in St. John would be sympathetic to the cause, and this would lead to the establishment of the Mount Tabor Church, so that you have some planters. The first property to be purchased by the, next slide please, let's see if you can get that one. Next slide. Yes. Okay, you hold that one, keep it right there on the screen because there's a reason why I've put it in there. First property to be purchased by the Moravian Church was at a spot, and you know, if you don't know it, in the Sharon Church, then you should go back to confirmation class and spend a little while. The first plot was at Bunkers Hill, in an area on top of the escarpment overlooking the second property, Sharon. It was at Bunkers Hill that some missionaries and their spouses and children were buried. The first enslaved convert, Anna, was also buried there. The site was easily one of the most important historical sites. But unfortunately, following a dispute over the ownership of the Moravian lands, said dispute over the ownership of the Moravian lands, for there's no doubt in my mind that historically the land belonged to the Moravian Church. One of the disputants allegedly, I am not in a court of law, allegedly commissioned a bulldozer to raise the burial site in 2007. It is my view that once the legal issues are sorted out, the church should seek to reestablish a visible memorial to the early pioneering work of this church at Bunkers Hill. That should be one of the first orders of business of this church, your church. Even if you can't put back together gravestones, you can have a memorial that honors the effort and work of those missionaries. In 1779, a decision was made to seek another site to relocate the mission from Bunkers Hill, but it's not until 1795 when the last service was held at Bunkers Hill, and the work shifted to the new site and mission to be called Sharon. So while I share with you that this is your 225th anniversary, the fact remains that, strictly speaking, you began a little bit before that. In fact, what I'm saying is that it began in the memory, in the mind. And later, when the foundation stone was laid in 1799, this is just a culmination of a series of activities that took place. We have to recognize then that since the 1630s, the Barbadian built landscape was dominated by the sugar plantation, and over time by the construction of the Sceaux-style great houses. From the very beginning of English settlement and colonization, the social landscape was also dominated by the Church of England. True, we might encounter the Sceaux-style Quaker meeting houses, but for the most part, in their case, we are left only with place names, including a few Quakers' roads, which are found across the island. Additionally, too, there was a Jewish presence But although there's some evidence that there's a synagogue in Speightstown, there's only one synagogue in Bridgetown. With the arrival of the Moravian Church, however, a new built element occurs in the landscape. And by the mid-19th century, a new social reality is present in Barbados as first the enslaved and later the emancipated masses chose a religious option that was not directly prescribed by the planters. In narrating this summary of the history of the Moravian Church in Barbados, then, we must be careful to avoid glorifying the church and its view of the enslaved. Some Moravians who served in various New World colonies owned slaves. You heard me? You know, Jesus is speaking to, I think it was in the Sermon on the Mount, he said that there were some people who may not necessarily have committed adultery, but they had it in their head. So once they had it in their head, they had already done it. It didn't mean that because it was in their head, they should go ahead and do it anyhow. That's not what he was saying. The fact remains that this is a reality. So some Moravians own slaves. It is true, and that what you see on the screen is going to be part of that narrative that I'm going to share with you. In our survey, we have presented a visual representation. That will follow the next slide, but let's deal with this one now. And I'm indebted to Sister Margaret Best and to Reverend Ezra Paris for making that sketch available to me, which you'll see shortly. It is not drawn to scale and is clearly a copy of the original held in Germany, in the Church's archives. Attached to the outline of the plot is a key written originally in German and translated into English. Even there, we find an indication of the duality. And by duality, I mean the two-sided nature of the attitude towards slaves that sometimes accompany the best efforts of European missionaries. In German, at number 8 on the key, we find the listing Neger Haus für Reich Familien, German for Negro house, and we put it nicely because in German, Neger is the word for black, but it also can mean nigger, which is what the term that we came to know later. So nigger house. So right there, next slide please. Right there, you actually, here it is. On the left side is the German, on the right side is the English, and at number 8, when it says Negro house for 3 families, even that bunker site is already showing us that these missionaries who had come still had some of the prejudices that they left Europe with. And the prejudices aren't because they hate black people. The prejudices are based on the fact that these people came from a heavily encrusted class society in which there were people at top and some at the bottom. And many church members believe that that was normal. I must tell you that some Barbadians believe that too. So you don't have to be a German or a European to believe that. Some Barbadians believe that too. So, if we find here in Barbados evidence that Moravians have this duality in their approach to the enslaved people, this is not unique. In an article published in volume 14, issue 2 of the Journal of Moravian History in 2014, and entitled Slavery, Ethnic Identity and Christianity in the 18th Century Moravian Antigua by a man called John Catron, the dilemma facing the Moravians is discussed. On the one hand, he looks at attitudes among Moravians towards slave ownership and notes that while they were active in a conversion mission among the enslaved, they still accepted enslavement as legal. And incidentally, there's a book, I think the name is called Slaves and Missionaries by Mary Turner. And she says that when the Moravian missionaries arrived in the Caribbean, from headquarters no less, they received instructions: when you get into those areas, do not deal with matters of distinctions between the upper classes and the others. Stay away from those discussions. So don't be surprised if the Moravians arrive and they saw slaves being owned, and some of them owned slaves themselves, and that they didn't interfere too much with that. That does not deny their sincerity and their desire for the conversion of the enslaved. In an online lecture by Dr. Scott Gordon, it is shown that Moravians in their Bethlehem settlement in the USA purchased and brought slaves to meet their labor needs. In some cases, they purchased slaves from the Caribbean, from places such as St. Thomas, St. Vincent, and Jamaica. In short, one of the reasons why estate owners were not so harsh toward Moravians was simply that the Moravians did not push an abolitionist agenda. That's the reality. All of us have, most of us have family members. And some of you have sisters and brothers. And you ever had a fight with a brother or sister yet? I didn't ask you to confess in here now. You know. I'm just saying that even in the best run households, you get some people that don't do the right thing. My uncle Delaney had a favorite pastime, which I call pinch the nephew. He liked to do that. Of course, his nephew, 7 years younger, had a favorite response, which was scratch the uncle. That's all it was. So this is clear. But we have to understand the reality. In Barbados, when the 1816 Buster Rebellion took place, the Moravian missionaries proudly declared that their congregations on the island were not involved. Why could they say that? They could say only because in their conversion experience, they were sure that their enslaved workers would not join the rebellion. Now, those of us, as a Sharon, might be a little annoyed with them and say they should leave the people to do what they want to do, but that's the reality. And then, if we look at Antigua again, just as a way of understanding this dilemma, when emancipation came, 1834 to 1838, Antigua did not have an apprenticeship system. Now, if you don't know what the apprenticeship system is, just a brief note will help us to understand. When enslavement was ended, the British government sought to give the planters a few more years of labor. So they came up with the apprenticeship system where the enslaved workers, who were now supposed to be free, had to work for the former estate owners for 2/3 of the week without pay, and 1/3 of the week with pay. This half slavery, half freedom situation served to expand or extend slavery for another 4 or 5 years. And that's the reality. But you didn't have an apprenticeship system in Antigua, because the Moravians convinced the authorities that the Moravian enslaved workers didn't need an apprenticeship system. They would be peaceful in the transition. And so Antigua did not have an apprenticeship system. We are aware, however, that Moravians did hold that enslaved people were human beings. Don't miss that. I've just told you that the Moravians, the other people, had their prejudices. Moravians, the other people, had their problems. And I'm saying, and the reason why I asked you about your family and if you had to fight with children before, because I just want to know, so you to understand, the same reason why you had conflicts within families, sibling rivalry and all kinds of things, is the same reason that you're going to have the same kind of issue going on. So here we are. The slaves were human beings who were entitled to hear the gospel. And that marks the essential difference that the Moravians brought to the island. In this context, then, we shift our attention to consider another aspect of the Moravian impact on the Barbadian society. And for that, we look at the question of naming. Because we just established that the Moravians came, they established settlements, that they kept slaves in some cases, but they're bringing the gospel, nevertheless. But they're also here, and their practice, something else is happening. And next slide, please. Next slide. Let's go with this first. One of the things and I've looked through the Moravian baptism records. This is 1769 to 1827. You find baptisms in the Moravian Church. And what we are fortunate here with is that the Moravians have left us with the former name of the enslaved worker, as well as the new name that they're getting. They give you, so this the plantation owners and the names. So you have a Miss Aline's estate, Dr. Bannister Devonish, and look at the one, number 1, 2, 3, 4 down. What does it say? Mission of the who? Mission of the who? Unitas Fractum, Mission of the Brethren. That's part of what we're saying to you just now. But here it is. If you look at the left, there's something you should know immediately. You don't have to be a historian to know that. Do you notice anything, any pattern do you notice there on the left? Biblical names. And so if you look at to the right now, some of the enslaved people do have English names, not all. But here on the left, you find John, Abraham, Joseph, Nathaniel, David, Stephen, Tobias, Jonah. Anytime you listen to your obituaries in Barbados, and you hear, we regret to announce the death of Joseph Nathaniel Hortis, or John Nathaniel Hortis. Anytime you hear that name doesn't belong to 2024. Because in 2024, the people call it Shan, Christian, all kinds of so. But at that time, nearly all the baptisms in the Moravian Church and the Anglican Church as well, and the Wesleyan Church, the names that were given are quote unquote Christian names. So that's where some names come from. But I want to make it clear that we did not get our names from the plantation owners, generally speaking. That's a myth. That's a myth. I'll say a bit more with that shortly. Former name, now under former name, you find Jack, Fortune, Kwashi. These are Akan names. In case you do not know, most of our ancestors came from Ghana on the Gold Coast. And their names reflected the day of the week they were born on. So if you're a boy, you were called Kwame. And you see, in fact, you see Kwame down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is a boy born on a Saturday. We spell that Kwame. Akan day names. So you've come across female names like Kwashiba and other names of that kind. Now you come down a little further, you see Kit, then you see Joseph. That Joseph is there, but that was the name given. Sometimes enslaved people did acquire English names. Primus Packet. I don't know if it was Packet because it came as part of a packet or something, I don't know. Rhode Island might suggest where the enslaved person was bought and shipped to the Barbados from Rhode Island. Coffee, this is also a Akan name. Coffee Mool, Coffee. Some respect Kofi. Many of you would have known of Kofi Annan. Those are Akan names. Clark, they have Sambo and Daniel, etc., etc. So the Moravian Church, together with other churches in Barbados, the Moravian Church is in fact largely responsible for what I call the naming conventions that we find here in Barbados today, Moravian and Anglican and Wesleyan. That is where we find it. Okay, next slide. Okay. So that apart from the question of Moravian education, incidentally, before you keep that on the screen, it is shown that the church has this influence on the naming selections. And so when we look at the baptism list, we find that the name Caroline replaced that of Kuba. Kuba was an African name, and you find that Caroline, and it was consistent because if you name one person whose name was Kuba, you name that person Caroline, you name that Kuba Caroline too. So that was common, very, very common. So the Moravian minister has a part to play in this. As Dr. Winnell Curtin Roberts observes in her very important work, before emancipation, the Moravians had established Sunday schools at Sharon and Mount Tabor. So quite apart from the whole question of the socialization that comes from naming, we now look at the question of education, which is one of the primary contributions of the Moravian Church. Her book, Created in Their Image, Evangelical Protestantism in Antigua and Barbados, 1834 to 1914, tells us about this establishment of Sunday schools. And they had, by emancipation, they had about 748 children in both Sunday and day schools. We're going to take a big leap past that time and the early years of emancipation, and we'll take a peep into the blue books of Barbados. Because the information that I'm sure if you know that follows, comes from the blue books. This is the first one, blue book, 1843 to 1847. And it identifies the Moravian schools in the island. And this is the first time that I see the record. And there's some names given as well. Charles Rutgers. I suspect that's a foreign missionary who is here and also a school teacher. But we have a Benjamin Stewart and an Elijah Stewart. I suspect that's husband and wife. And Robert James Shepherd and a Samuel Ali. These are the first teachers, Moravian teachers that we are identifying. I'm going to say a bit more about that, about Moravian teachers. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now we get to 1866 to 1869, and again now we have a listing of students and teachers from the schools. Some of these surnames will be familiar to some of you. Some will not be because they're you know, I know that some of you are closer to my generation, but at the same time, you're not that far that you think about. Here I have names, surnames like Carrington, Padmore, Simons, Thompson, Perkins, Moore, Pilgrim, Buckley, Stewart. These names that you see here, I've put them here because these are not accidental placements. These are telling a story. People have just been freed from enslavement. Most enslaved people are illiterate, meaning they can't read and write. But after emancipation, you have most of these are black teachers who are appearing in the Moravian schools. And so by 1866, you have Sharon Premier, Sharon Infants, Buxton, Montgomery, Dunscombe, Centenary. You have Clifton Hill, Mount Tabor. All right, next slide, please. I think there should be another one following that. Next slide. Yes, this is the same slide. The other schools that you pick up, like Blackman's. Do you know where Blackman's is? Do you know where Blackman's is? Yes. Some people say yes, but I ain't sure when you say yes that you know where Blackman's is. Say where it is? Well, you should know because you taught right there, so if you didn't know Blackman's, that's where you had a church. You had Blackman's, you had Roebuck, you had Grace Hill, you had a school called Wrights. And just the other day, I was listening to a television program, the one that comes after the news, where Hal Eiffel it is. It was talking about Wrights and Hinks. These are Moravian schools, some which have disappeared off the social landscape. But here are the people who are making history of Barbados. The transformation is taking place in the island. Not only in Moravian schools, but also in Moravian schools. Next slide, please. This is 1883. And in 1883, again, we pick up some other teachers. We find that O.C. Haynes, A.M. Jones, or Hollingshead, F.R.C. Roberts, or Hewitt, a dean, Alton Trotman, and they tell you a pupil teacher. So in that extract, which I took from the blue books, you're also getting a peep into how the education system is developed. Many of the formerly enslaved people go to school and then become pupil teachers. And once they become pupil teachers, they get training, and then they turn up. My late grandfather was a pupil teacher at the Southborough School, Clifton Hill, and later he became the principal there. And later on, you have a man like Guinness Lewis, who was the patriarch of the Lewis clan from Chimborazo. They were all pupil teachers. So here I have the next set, please, next set. Okay, you have continuing F.F. Jordan and John Motley, George Roberts, and when you say an assist, I mean the assistant teachers as well. Next slide. Next slide. We're going to move you faster. Still, next slide, I think. Yes, next slide. This is 1899, though. I'm just pushing you through quickly there. Again, we're coming closer to our time, your time. And again, the names that are listed here represent the transformation that's taking place in Barbados. The middle class that we see emerging in Barbados is being shaped by this, what's happening in schools. And artisans, some artisans are also part of that group. And some of the artisans have the beginnings of their education in the Moravian schools and other schools. So you have a lot of, you have Miss Barrow, E.F. Barrow, and a sewing mistress, that kind of thing. You have that. Next slide, please. Next slide. In 1909, it said getting even closer to our time. And here you have again a number of teachers here: J.M. Green, A. King, Perkins, Nichols, Daniel Roberts, Allenby, Light, Cummins, Bethel, Critchlow. These are all names that will be known to our ancestors. Next slide. This one, next one should be 1919. Yes, that's close again. And you have the school, you have a description on the boys and girls, etc. You have a teacher, and it tells you how many teachers certified, number of assistant teachers, number of pupil teachers, and then you also have, of course, number of boys and girls in the school. You look at the transformation in Barbados that's taking place over time. We're going to run again very quickly and say a little bit about this education system. In speaking about the pivotal role of the Moravian Church in the education system of Barbados from the immediate post-emancipation period right up into the early 20th century, one name looms larger than any other: James Young Edgell. Most secondary sources list him as being born in 1821. However, my own strenuous search reveals his baptism as occurring on January 25th, 1823. His parents were Thomas and Elizabeth Edgell, and the baptism apparently took place at Bridgetown at the cathedral. Incidentally, when he dies later, he will be buried at the cathedral, and his wife would also be buried there. I tend to see his birth probably has taken place in late 1822, with the baptism a couple of months later in 1823. He received a very good education, became a reporter in the court system, and then eventually became a printer, and then became part of a newspaper system. In fact, there's a newspaper called the West Indian newspaper, and he was a tremendous contributor to that paper. Now, he's also contemporary of national hero Samuel Jackman Prescott. Prescott was editor of a newspaper called The Liberal, and this is what Edgell pronounces on Prescott and the Liberal writers. Let's read it. It says, "Let the Liberal be satisfied that when the hour arrives for promoting reform in these columns, the West Indian, that is the paper where Edgell is the editor, the West Indian, if in the hands of the present director, Edgell, will be found on the side of truth and justice and labor as manfully as any journalist for equal rights, equal privileges, and equal protection for all ranks and classes. It is possibly too late, but James Young Edgell should be a national hero of Barbados." And I say that because if you read his products by each time, he is challenging the social order. And he's doing much for the downtrodden masses. Next slide, please. Next slide, next slide. This is something which he says: "If the poor are not sought out and enlightened, and an interest taken in their welfare, they will someday remind us of our neglect in a manner which will startle us all. and this may lead to the most serious and alarming consequences. That is not too long before the 1876 Confederation rests in Barbados. Edghill. It was Edghill who described, who developed what's called the Ragged Schools in Barbados, schools for the poor. It was Edghill who established the first school at Sharon, Montego, and the city, and in the city. We're also going to note something that he says. When we look at the whole question of the centenary jubilee of the Moravian Church in, I think, that would be 1875 or thereabouts, 1865. Turn the next slide, please. I want to bring these folk closer to home. Next slide. Next slide. Yes, this is Edghill talking about Sharon and talking about the centenary. He says it will be of interest for you to learn that the Moravians will celebrate the centenary jubilee of the Barbados Mission this year. I wish to erect a memorial school on that occasion in Sharon. I trust that you and your brethren of the broadsheet, that is talking about the newspapers, will lend me your aid, and I commend the subject to the special notice of your summary writers. Edghill manages to get through that appeal support so that he gets the money to build the memorial school at Sharon. In addition to that, the Moravian Church gets the biggest grant from the local legislature of all the churches. The Moravian Church got about, try to remember the actual, oh yes, it got an increase of 60%. The Anglicans got an increase of 11%, and the Methodists got no increase at all. Edghill's work brought success to the Moravian Church. So as we look through these early years of the Moravian presence, we come now to very quickly to just identify a couple of persons who I've included in my talk with you. One, the person I want to introduce you to is a man called Daniel Tull. You don't know him? Yes. He left Barbados in 1876. But where was he schooled? He was schooled at Sharon. He was schooled elsewhere in the Moravian system. And he left Barbados and traveled through St. Lucia to England. And eventually marries a white woman in England. I doubt if he were in Barbados, he would be married to a white woman. But the fact that he goes to England and establishes himself as a master artisan is testimony to what he learned in the Moravian school system in Barbados. A man called Phil Vasily wrote an article on him in the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, which I have the honor to edit that journal, and that article was published in 2022 on Daniel Tull and his family. And that author researched these churches in Barbados and found that. And now, as I said, the last lap. Here am I, standing before you and speaking to you about the Moravian contribution. And I would, it'd be remiss of me not to talk about its contribution to me, how I got here. My own family history is testimony to the contribution of the Moravian Church. The genealogical connection that connects my esteemed mother, Dame Maisie Welch, to the Moravian Church begins in the 1840s. My mother's maternal great-great-grandmother, Rebecca Ann Grant, was born in November 1844 and was christened and baptized at Montego Moravian Church on March 23, 1845. My mother's great-great-grandmother was her mother, this lady's mother, Rebecca Ann Grant's mother, and that great-great-great-grandmother was called Mary Delia. And her address was Haynesfield, St. John. Haynesfield, St. John was the land given by Edmund Haynes to the Moravian Church. Mary Delia, the one who was mentioned, was baptized as an adult at Mount Tim Moravian Church in 1843. Her husband was also baptized at the same church. They were both receiving the congregation on the 11th of May, 1845, and admitted to Holy Communion on January 26, 1852. Why so long? Well, one of the things that made it long is because the Moravians, one thing the Moravian ministers were very concerned about was whether there was any little hanky-panky going on in the home before, you know. So if you live in the house with somebody, watch it. I share something at my grandmother's funeral. Some people were a little annoyed. My grandmother, Ashley Aurora, we knew her as Padmore, but when I checked, she was not Padmore at all. She was born as Robinson. Her father and mother got married 6 months later, and he's Padmore. But the minister of the church, the St. Matthew's Church at the time, crossed. When he put down, he had her as Padmore first. But then he did a double take and said, well, these people, they're living together here. So he crossed the name out. And in the original book and the archives, you see it's crossed through. Crossed through Padmore and puts Robinson. So a lot of things. See, the old people still hide a lot of things from you, but they can't hide everything. But here it is, the record is there. I also note from this record, from my great-great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Dead, that these are people who come out of enslavement without much hope in society. But over the years, they develop a hope. Some of the hope they develop is based on what they are taught in the Moravian Church. The Moravian Church gives them a sense of themselves. And they become proud of themselves. And they also see the future as having possibilities. So later on, they educated their children. And eventually my mother, I ended up being educated and going on to teach in St. Bernard's and St. Joseph. And then eventually becomes Dame Maisie Barker-Welch, but it began in the Moravian Church from a slave woman called Mary Delia. So finally, I'm not making excuses for the Moravian missionaries. What I simply intend for you is that you, students of history all, that you avoid oversimplification of the narrative and open yourselves to the reality of the Caribbean life in the 18th and 19th century. The fact is that in spite of the human weaknesses of the pioneer missionaries, their intervention into the Barbadian society represents part of the foundation upon which many of our achievements are based. I am proud of that history. Next slide, please, God, there's something, yes. In this slide, which I thought to put here, is one of the first symbolic elements that I ever saw in my young life. And you know it. Can you go back, please? Just got the one before. Go up to these things. Yes, that is the word in. Visit not Agnus Noster eam sequamur, and you know that's Latin. Our Lamb has conquered, let us follow him. That is the motto. That was a vision of the future. And that vision of the future has led to the transformation of our Barbadian society. The Moravian Church must therefore take a proud stand on its history with all the errors that we might find from the old missionaries. Take that into consideration. But remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of. Our forefathers did not become Christian because Moravian because they were brainwashed. They became Christian because they read the scriptures. And in the scriptures, they found something that said, we are persons. We are created beings in the image of God. Visit Nostos Agna eam sequamur. That is what they would have said. Our Lamb has conquered. Let us follow him. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor Welch. That was enlightening, wasn't it? And even though some of you knew some of the information being here at Sharon, it actually gave a basis and a foundation to a lot of the stuff that you've been hearing and that you know and that you do every Sunday. So thank you. Thank you again. Are there any questions for Professor? I'm sure you're bubbling with them, but nobody wants to be first. Yes.
This presentation of schools.
There's a microphone here, so just so that they can all hear.
What is it, Mr. Eiffel, right? Is it Mr. Eiffel?
Yes, just identify yourself, please.
David Folks.
Oh, yeah, folks.
Yeah.
Folks?
Yes.
Okay.
Everybody together.
He's going to place your name now in history, so.
No problem. In your presentation of schools, I recognize several of them, but I didn't recognize the Wrights and Hinks.
Yes.
Is there any information you can give me as to what they have generated into now, or is it just fade out of history?
It appears to me that some of those schools no longer exist. I'm not sure at this point of the reason why they were closed down. But Hinks represents the name of a Barbados governor, Governor Hinks, and there's a street in Barbados named after him, Hinks Street. And I suspect that the initial presence in Bridgetown was at Hinks Street, in that area. And you had the school called the Hinks School. But when it comes to the question of the Wright School, I've been trying to ascertain exactly where that was located. But it does not seem that it went on for too long. I know for sure that if you read the work by James Young Edgell himself, you will come across some references to some of these names. Where he picked up these names was from the Barbados Blue Books. The Blue Books were books that were used by the authorities to present information on the education system, number of students, who was the head teacher, that kind of thing, where they were located. And so you can find that. There are also some education reports for the period that speak about these schools. But as far as I can gather, these schools disappeared out of the listing, probably before we get fully into before the 1940s, 1950s, long before that, they disappeared. You're going to find that most of you will be familiar with schools are no longer present nowadays either. Buxton, the other school, Montgomery. These are schools that you know about. Some of you knew them. Some of you remember teachers like the Cuffley brothers. You remember those schools, but most of those schools are no longer in existence. In some cases, some of them would have closed when the government took over the education, or the primary and elementary education. In some cases, the government did not retain them. In some cases, the Moravians continued to hold ownership of the lands. If I'm not mistaken, the Montgomery School, the lands there still belong to the Moravian Church. Yeah, so that is where it is, but definitely the schools just shut down. In some cases, part of the question of finance is a big problem. Maintenance. James Young Edgell did make the point when he appealed for some funding in 1865 that the Moravians are facing severe problems in funding. The government gave them £500 per annum, but £500 could not sustain all these schools. But I wish somebody would dig find the exact location, but definitely I think Hinks was located in Bridgetown. And Wrights, I'm not sure exactly where that was located. But I was looking for Hal Eiffel. He's not here with us tonight, but he might probably have an idea. I listened to him the other night on the program on television, and he mentioned the 2 schools. He's the only person I've ever heard mention the schools. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question here.
Yeah.
Joseph Stull is my name. I was
Buenos
wondering
Aires.
if the slaves that were freed in Antigua, who went directly into freedom, if they turned out to be any better off than those in Barbados who went through the apprenticeship system.
It's a very interesting question. The fact of the matter is that the apprenticeship system itself was doomed to failure from the very beginning. In the case of Barbados and the other colonies, the apprenticeship system was supposed to have gone to 1840, but it ended in 1838. And the reason why it ended in 1838 because the British government came to the conclusion that it was a waste of time. But the planters by that time had already got 4 years extra from the formerly enslaved workers. And incidentally, we know now the British government raised 20 million pounds on the British capital markets to pay the planters for freeing their enslaved people. But not one red cent was given to any black person or a former slave, compensating them for what they went through. That's one of the reasons why, as the former chairman of the Task Force on Reparations, we've insisted they stole us. They owe us. They should pay us. I'm not saying should pay you. I say should pay us. There's a distinction. But that's the reality. The Moravians said that of the church in Antigua, and the British government agreed. They didn't have an apprenticeship system. Maybe they could have gone straight for full freedom in Barbados too. I don't know why. I don't have any answers as to why, and the comparison that you asked about. I don't think I can't remember any war that I do know for was that look to see if, because it's what we call a contrafactual investigation. It'll be after the fact. I don't know if we can find out, because we really can't look back in that time and really get out the true answer. But it's quite possible that that if the president Barbados, they could have done without the apprenticeship system. Yeah.
Yes, you have another question?
I just want to pick you up on the reparations part. We're going through this whole reparations thing now, and I guess it will go on after we are long gone.
And not speak for yourself, bro.
But I am wondering how you feel. Suppose we do get the reparations, right? How do you feel it should work? Should you take up a bag full of money and give each family a couple $100, or set it aside so that the poorer people be able to draw from it? Or how do you feel it should work?
You might be aware of the Convention carried by Professor Pedro Welch. It's a 10-point plan. And the plan suggests that reparations should take the form of the governments of Britain and the other countries that own the Caribbean, providing development funding. And that development funding could be used to build new schools, to equip schools, so they don't have to come to us individually. So I think that there's this notion that they're going to pay all of us, because part of the problem with us, I'm going to say no, because some people have behind these things. During the period of enslavement, some black people owned slaves. Susanna Ostrahan, one who owned one of the biggest hotels down there at Cumberland Street, was called the Lord Mayor's Place down there. She owned slaves. National heroine Sarah Ann Gill owned slaves. Her husband owned slaves. Nancy Clark, another slave, owned slaves. London Born owned slaves. A lot of people, and I argued that the reason why many of these people own slaves is simply this. If you live in a slave society where the norm is enslavement and racism, what is the badge of your freedom? When you become free, what's the clearest, uncontrovertible sign that you are free? What is it? Your ability or capacity to own somebody else. So as some people get freed, and not too long after, they go and invest in some slaves. It's a very good investment. So they invest. Now we look at them from a moral point of view. And to some extent, our moral hindsight is valid. But at the same time, you have to read it from their perspective then. And many of them, as I said, they've got slaves because that was the norm in the society. And all of them did not treat this enslaved people badly either, because I've come across Susanna Ostrahan doing something which is tremendous. The Barbadian planters increased the price of manumission, that is the fee for setting free a slave, from £50 for a woman or a man around 1799 to £300 for a woman and £250 for a man. Now that time, that is tantum money, that's money. They increased that. What Susanna Ostrahan and some of her compatriots did, and I found evidence for some 800 people who were set free by these people. They went into a agreement with a British ship's captain, arranged for him to go off to England. And when he went off to England, he would effect what we call the conveyance that would set free these enslaved people, and it only cost 15 shillings in England. What it cost in Barbados for a woman, £300. So we find many of these people who own slaves are in fact working to free some of their enslaved workers through that means. So it's a very complex story, and it's part of the thing, but that's the reality. But if you have to, so if I got to pay some of these baiters here, some of the baiters, some of the individual baiters, if they're not back in their history, they might find that some of their ancestors had some slaves too. So I know what you're going to do.
And just a question, isn't it also a case where Susanna Ostrahan had a hotel?
Yes.
And she would have to run the hotel.
Oh, yes.
So there was nobody else to run it but slaves.
Well, yes and no. I mean, she could have sought other alternatives, but don't, when we said we ran a hotel, we have to remember something else. That the hotel was, what's the word? It was a place, one writer who visited Barbados called it a place where you have an attendant to remove the curtains. And what it really meant was that these were brothels. So Susanna Ostrahan, Nancy Clark, Caroline Lee, all them people, Rachel Pringle, all of them had female prostitutes in those hotels. But again, don't measure them by your time. Measure them by the reality that they face. And notwithstanding how reprehensible we think it is, these people found room to maneuver options in the slave society. And what they did is they used the best that they could. And if that included using some female property as collateral, well, I've got some people who do it nowadays. You may not call it a hotel and call it a brothel, but
By any other name.
by any other.
We have another question here.
Oh, Lord.
Good night.
Good night.
My name is Sheila Chase. Two things. One, in reference to persons in connection with the other black people, other slaves. I used to hear my grandmother saying that her brother was a third-class driver on this plantation. And I used to say to myself, well, how come if they didn't have a lot of carriers and buses on the island, that he was a third-class driver? Only to discover from studying history that his job on the plantation was to drive the other people working on the plantation.
But these were people who who the boss is.
Right,
Yanks.
he was a big thing in their village because he was this third-class driver. The other thing is that I noticed when you were giving the list for the schools that you mentioned pupil teachers. Would you like to give any elucidation on that pupil?
Basically, I mean, quite quickly, you have a situation, you just had emancipation. After emancipation, you're building a free society. And in order to build a free society, you don't have all the human resources that you need. So you begin first in these church schools, these Sunday schools, and you begin to train people there. Some of these people that you train are pupils, but eventually some of them develop enough knowledge profile that they could then be asked to teach the others like themselves. And that's how the system began. But it didn't exist only in Barbados, it also was borrowed from England. In England, you also had people teachers. It's not a Barbadian invention. And what would happen is that once you went to school, in those days, you went to what people call 7 standard. And once you went to that level, you had acquired enough knowledge, skill, to be asked to teach. And you taught for a number of years under the supervision of a teacher. Well, a master teacher, or somebody who was well trained, and at the end, and during that time you were assessed, and at the end of the assessment, then you were qualified.
Were you paid?
But you didn't begin with payment. Some of them began, you didn't get payment. So some of them were paid.
I asked you that question because my mother was a pupil teacher. Her father, in his wisdom, took her out of school and sent her to needlework. And he passed away when she was still young. And my uncle, your grandfather, took her back to school and made her pupil teacher. And she stayed in the system and studied privately. And that's how she became a qualified teacher and eventually a principal of Clifton Hill School.
That is true. Her
No, I will not be so irreverent in God's house.
You're not saying that, but the fact remains that the implication is clear. That my grandfather, Reverend Frank Barker, he was responsible for helping a number of persons through the system. He'd gone through the system himself, and he was able to teach them the ropes and help them through the system. And eventually some of them became pupil teachers, then teachers, and then later on became principals or head teachers. And your late mother, Pearl Vashti, I think Vashti was her name, yeah. Pearl Vashti Weeks, she's a Barker before all that. She was one of the teachers. My grandfather, he was a pupil teacher, then became a teacher at Southborough School, and then principal. That's how I went.
So I jumped out at me when the list went up.
Well, you should have told us too that you became a teacher yourself. And you were stepping on the ladder created by your ancestors, starting in the Moravian Church. What has God wrought? Have mercy. Well done.
Good.
If there are no more questions, I have one, and I'm asking if you can elaborate a bit on the Bunker Hill issue and tell us what the present situation, because I know that was a particular peeve of George Ramsay when they went to destroy that area. What's the present situation with it?
I am not aware as to the legal issue, but my understanding is that there was a person to whom the church rented land, and that person, no, it's not a big chunk of money, but I suspect that over the years what happened was that there was a bit of neglect in following up. So eventually, apparently, some members of the family were able to get a piece of the land and encroach on it. And as far as I understand, in the direction, the church is willing to write off the slate and let those who had occupied land continue to occupy them. That was my understanding. But during the very long, drawn-out case, somebody got a little impatient and eventually brought a bulldozer and destroyed the tombstones, which is sacred as far as I'm concerned. But the thing about it is this, is that I do not know what your leaders, those who are on the leadership board, where the thing stands. Because as far as I'm concerned, by now, the matter should have been resolved. There's no reason why the matter should continue. And as I said, the minute that you get it done, I recommend again that you need to establish a memorial on Bunkers Hill, a memorial of dedication to the pioneers, including Anna, the first slave to be converted and to be buried there. You need to do that. And so that future generations will come, as in the Bible, they will ask, the question we ask, what meanest thou these stones? And you will be able to say, this is what this means. So I really want to, that's where it is. But your leaders, I'm not party to the legal discussion, but I feel a little annoyed myself that you could have a case going on for so many years, and you stick this 2007. This is now 17 years later. By now, even if you can't get back to your land, at least the graveyard where you buried the enslaved people, that should revert to you. That should not be a problem. And in fact, my understanding is that the land surveyors who were looking at the matter can testify that the lands of there were understood to be Moravian lands, church lands. And one way of establishing that, I would spent the last few weeks looking, but I couldn't find the deeds that I'm looking for. But we know the plantations that which were what we call a button and a bounding. And once you know those plantations, you go through the plantation list and look at who is on the boundary of the plantation. And then you look at the current owners and trace back. And once you go back in time, you will see where current owners, where the lands come with respect to plantation lands, and you can say, aha, but this is where. So something has to be done.
There's a challenge for the people of Sharon, and you have two able real estate people who should be able to take up the argument from George Ramsay and follow through. So one other question. Last question.
Then they had the information on the screen relative to the tribes that the persons came from. I became interested in that. I'm not familiar with Papa. What part of
Papa, there's one thing that you want to be real is that I'm very conscious that sometimes when we're reading from historic documents, that we're also reading the misprint and the misinterpretation of those. Papa is from the Sacramento. It's not from Papua New Guinea. It's not from Papua New Guinea. It's from Papua New Guinea. And it may apply to some of it. I will try to find out, and after this meeting, at some point, I will try to find out what that would mean.
I want to ask another question relative to the Igbo. I'm wondering whether the Igbo and Igbo, IGBO and EBO are the same tribe or not the same?
Igbo, and the other one that we call Akan, the Akan, are based on the days of the week, Kwame and all that, Kofi. The Akan have other names. They were also known as the Koromanti, the Ashanti, and the Asante. So they're various names. Asante, Ashanti, Koromanti, and Akan. The Akan name is still known today. If you go on your computer and look for Akan, you come across the name Akan. They occupied Ghana, and their ruler, the traditional ruler, is known as the Asante. The Asante came to Barbados and dedicated the building on the university, which we call the Golden Stool, because they have a tradition about the Golden Stool. But the Asante, or the Ashanti, as we call them, and if you were to say Maha or Mahaji, you're speaking tree.
I just want to mention one final thing.
Yes.
I was looking at a documentary recently, and persons said they're from Igbo tribe, and said they trace their family back to the Black Israelites.
That is a discussion that belongs more in than in what I call proven history. The fact is, however, that we do know that some blacks had traditions that can be traced back to Israel. If you go into South Africa, there are groups that still have many traditions, Jewish traditions. If you go to Ethiopia, there's a group called the Falasha Jews. And if you look at what they practice, so there is no doubt that there were blacks who are Jewish in their origin, etc. I don't really have any quarrel with somebody who wants to identify themselves as black Jewish. They look into the Bible, look at the Song of Solomon, when Solomon declared, I am black and comely. But that might be so, but I don't know that we can give a lot of store to that. All I can say is that if a person gets a sense of themselves that is elevated by linking themselves to these groups, well, good for them.
All right.
Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Welch.
Right.
I think that we need to give Professor Welch a big thank you. It has been extremely informative, and I think there's a lot of food for thought for Moravians and people who are not Moravian, because that forms a lot of the basis of Barbadian education. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
My pleasure. All right.